Hello, welcome to A Life Without Parole, a true crime YouTube channel. Today I want to talk about a case that goes way back in time. Even though it happened many years ago, it's still very interesting. So let's talk about it. The case today is about Adolf Zetlitz Jr. He was born on July 5th, 1898. Way back when, in the Czech Republic. By the age of 7, he and his family immigrated to the United States, living in the state of Washington. By the time he was 21, his family had moved to Powell County, Idaho. They moved to Idaho so that they could homestead farmland. The Homestead Act of 1862 opened up millions of acres. So the rules in the Homestead Act had to do with any adult that had never taken up arms against the federal government of the United States could apply. So it's pretty wide open. Women and immigrants who had applied for citizenship were eligible for 160 acres of land. This family in Powell County, Idaho, lived far out in the country by other families who were also homesteading. On average, the homes were a mile to 2 miles apart, just based on the geography, the layout of the land, because of where rocks were and where there was farmable land, etc. The Powell County homesteaders became a community of their own. Most went to church together at a congregation in Aberdeen, not too far away. It's about 16 miles. And they even started a small school way out in the middle of their farmland. At the age of 29, Adolf married Matilda Orth, who went by the name of Tilly. I believe he must have met her when he was going to church in Aberdeen because she was from Aberdeen. When Adolf was 31, he had his own residence in Pleasant Valley, Idaho, along with his wife, Tilly. By the time he was 32, his first child, Ruby, was born. The closest hospital to their house was about 14 miles away in American Falls. In 1831, another daughter, Gertrude, was born, and by the time Adolf was 35 years old, his third child was also born, and this was a son named Don. Life on the farm was hard work, and eventually it started to take a toll on the marriage. There were many fights between Adolf and his wife. One Sunday on November 8th, 1936, Adolf, accompanied by his 3 children and his wife Tilly, drove the 14-mile drive to American Falls to drop Tilly off. She was getting dropped off at a local hospital. She wasn't feeling well and she had a scheduled surgery the very next day. Adolf drove back to his home with his children. A teacher named Mr. Herbert White, who taught in that small farmhouse school, stopped by for a visit that Sunday evening. He said that Adolf cooked a nice dinner for the children and then put them to bed. This house was small. All the children slept in the same room. After dinner and after the children were in bed, Adolf talked with the school teacher until around 8:30 that evening. Then after that, Mr. White went home. According to Mr. White, he and Adolf had a lovely evening, and he found nothing amiss. Mr. Zetlitz was a friend and a member of the school board and hosted him for dinner that night. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Oh, was that going to change? Okay, by about 11:30 that evening, there was a neighbor who lived a few miles away who noticed some billowing smoke. He and some other farmers just raced to the home to see what was the cause of the fire. On that particular day in November, it was cold and there was snow on the ground. As they arrived at the home, the entire place was just billowing with smoke and flames. They tried to enter the front door, but it was locked. The back door was also locked. That's an interesting little side note because really people didn't lock their doors much back then in that rural area, but nonetheless it was locked. Since the home was so far from town, there really was nothing that they could do about the fire. There was also a barn that wasn't too far from the house, but that wasn't touched at all by the fire. So it was fine, just the home. Once the fire burned down some, the searchers were able to break into the house to see if they could find any survivors. Now, before I continue with further details about this fire and the tragedy that unfolded all those years ago, I just want to interject a few stories that float around this homestead still in 2023. I also need to put a little background information. I grew up in the county right next door in Bingham County. So I have personal friends and family that I've heard these stories from. Okay, there are many people who've experienced some crazy things around that farm site. So I'm just going to tell you 3. I'm going to go ahead and just change the names of the people that I'm talking about because they don't want to be identified. Okay, here's the first one. Okay, this event happened in 2023. Okay, now remember, this fire that I'm talking about, that was back in 1936, so 87 years prior. Okay, there's a young man in 2023, and I'm going to call him, I'll call him Tyler. He was working a job in Power County, gathering soil samples in farms all around the area. One day he was driving along in his work truck with his trusty dog, and all along the way for his job, he would stop, get soil samples, inch along, stop, get soil samples, and continue on like this. My father actually did this same job way back in the day. The main reason to get soil samples is so that you can test the soil and then you can see how the crops are doing, what the crops need, etc. On one occasion, as he was bending down to gather up some soil, he heard a child scream, and it sounded like it was really close by. So Tyler immediately looked up and saw a young girl with shaggy dangling hair dangling down over her face. He started to walk towards her to see if he could help or if she needed assistance or what was going on. And then he heard his dog behind him barking and growling in his truck. He immediately turned to see what the dog was barking at and realized he was barking towards that same little girl. As soon as he turned back to see how the girl was, he realized she had vanished. He ran over there to where the little girl had been standing, and the soil was somewhat wet underneath the surface, so there's no way she could have walked without being able to see where she had been. But there was nothing there. She was a ghost. Tyler drove quickly to an area where a lot of the local farmers congregate, and he started to tell them about what happened to him. As soon as he said he'd heard a scream, but before he could even tell the rest of what happened to him, the farmers cut in and said, "Did you see the ghost of the little girl?" Apparently they had all seen her. Oh, okay. So that's story number 1. Let me tell you story number 2. Okay, not far from this little girl sighting, there was another incident that appeared to be the same little girl. Okay, this one happened during harvest season. A local farmer had hired some Mexican laborers to help him with all the extra work that harvest brings. Because the farmland is so far out from any towns, the farmer fed his laborers lunch in his home. One day, while a group of the men were sitting around the lunch table eating, a young, unkept girl walked into the house walked around the entire table, and then exited the home. She appeared to be somewhat translucent and didn't seem to be touching the floor. So, as you can imagine, this scared those laborers. It scared them so much they ran out and left. In fact, they never came back and worked for that farmer again. They were, peace out, I'm gone, no way. They said they saw a ghost. Okay, third story. This is my final ghost story, tied in with this. Okay, this one has to do with equipment failure. So farming now is really high tech. I don't know how many of you have on a farm lately, but yeah, it's pretty digitized and fancy, let's just say. As soil samples are taken, the information for every single plot of ground is put into the computer, and the entire area is mapped out like a grid. Any critical information about the chemical makeup of the soil is updated on a regular basis. Okay, so a young man, this one I'm going to call Bo, worked all over the country, gathering up soil every single day. But there was this one plot that when he put the data into his computer, it would malfunction and all the data would be lost. This happened over and over. As he was talking about the frustration of the malfunction to his boss, he was asked what plot it was that kept on being messed up. After the boss learned which plot it was, Bo was told, "Oh, that's the ghost farm. It's no wonder. We always have weird happenings out there." Okay, let's go back in time 87 years and get back to our story about that farmhouse that was being burned to the ground. Remember, there were people who were gathering to the home to see what was the cause of the fire. And it was the middle of the night. But they were not able to render aid, remember, due to the lack of fire equipment and the fact that it was just so blazing. So they just stood to see the little farmhouse razed to the ground. Friends and family members were at first of the opinion that maybe Mr. and Mrs. Zetlitz were in the burning home. No one seemed to know that the father had accompanied his 3 children and the mother to the hospital the prior day. So these immediate neighbors didn't know that she was actually in the hospital. When the fire died down, only the children's bodies were discovered. Oh, remember those 3 little children? The searchers spent hours scanning all over the fields and sagebrush flats, expecting to find the parents, either collapsed or just unnerved by this horrible ordeal. But that's when they discovered a grisly scene. The Zetlitz 3 young children's charred remains were in their beds, but Mr. and Mrs. Zetlitz were not. They had to wonder, had the parents died from smoke inhalation? And were they somewhere in the countryside dead? Or delirious? Or what? Where were these parents? As the neighbors searched fiercely for the missing parents, they noticed something. Fresh tracks in the snow leading away from the house window. Obviously, someone had escaped the flames. At first light in the morning, they got some trackers to follow along where these tracks led. They noticed that occasionally it appeared that the person who was running away stopped, turned around, and looked back at the burning house. They continued on for 15 to 20 miles. Eventually, whoever was these footprints jumped onto a passing train headed for Rupert, Idaho. Didn't take long for police to find and arrest Adolf Zetlitz Jr. in Rupert. Oh, and by the way, his house reeked of gasoline smell, and it was starting to become clear that the fire was set intentionally. One day after the fire, Zetlitz was back in American Falls. On that same day, he confessed to the killings. Oh, you might think this is where it ends, but no. There's a lot more to this story. Oh, it is a crazy one. During his confession, he admitted that he killed his 3 children. Now, there might have been a little bit of a misinterpretation because English wasn't his first language. But even though English wasn't his first language, it was clear that he was admitting that he killed the children. So it appeared that he was going to plead guilty. According to him and the translation, his reasoning for killing these children, they seemed to be in the road. Okay, when I first read that, I was thinking, was he punishing the children because they were in the road? I mean, it just didn't make sense. And I finally realized this is the way that he was explaining that they were in the road between him and his wife. In other words, they were in the way. They were in the way. Okay. It gets crazier. Even though I'm just amazed that wicked people in the world could be like this. I mean, I was thinking, I was talking to a friend the other day, and she was asking me if I thought narcissistic sociopaths have always been around or if they're more recent. And I don't know. I think that they probably have always been around. We just didn't know what the words were. We didn't have terminology, or they weren't diagnosed. But I can't help but wonder if this Mr. Zetlitz was a narcissistic sociopath. I would love to hear your opinions and comments. What do you think? Do you think narcissistic sociopaths have been around from the beginning of time? Or do you think it's kind of a new era type mental illness? Comment below and let me know your thoughts. So Zetlitz is a father who admits to killing his children and setting his own house on fire. And it makes you wonder, what could have been done? What could have been going through his head to bring him to this? There has to be more to this story. But as his excuses unfold, there doesn't seem to be much of a defense. When asked by the police how the children died, he told the police that he shot them each, one by one, in the head. But no, this is not truth. This is one of his first lies. He claims that they were asleep and he put on lovely music so they wouldn't hear each other getting shot and no one aroused or awoke and whatever. He tries to make it like it's a humane killing. But no. He then goes on to say that he poured gasoline down that he had gotten straight out of his car onto the house, lit it on fire, jumped out the window, and ran for it. All of this was easy to document. He admits it, and it was easy to see. Footprints in the snow gave it away. I wonder if he thought the evidence would be destroyed in the fire, and that maybe even folks would think that he died in the fire as well, and he could just run for it. The reason why I wonder this is because later on, well, I don't want to jump ahead, but anyway, I'm guessing that's what he was trying to do. He just wanted out of his responsibilities, out of his marriage, out of everything. It's crazy because he even left behind his dog. I mean, there's just this sad picture. It's so hard to be able to decipher what it is, but it's the picture of his dog looking at the burned house, longing for his family. It's just so sad. So anyway, as the trial progressed and further evidence started to come to surface, the reality of what happened was far more horrific than the confession that Mr. Zetlitz had given. There's one thing that I've noticed, and I think this is, I've been watching the behavior panel and they dissect people's confessions, and this is one thing that I've learned. During confessions, a lot of times the perpetrator will minimize their actions and try to make it sound like it's not as bad as it really is. He certainly was doing that. I mean, it's so much like Lori Vallow. It's not like Lori Vallow ever confessed to killing her children, but as the evidence in the trial came out, the reality was way worse than what we ever imagined it could be. And especially when it comes to how those children were killed. Oh, it's just horrific. Now imagine being in the hospital. Let's think about the wife for a minute. She's in the hospital, sick. We don't know what. It's not documented in the public records what she was sick, but we do know she was preparing for surgery. And then she found out the next morning that her children were murdered by her husband. Her father and her brother came to the hospital. It was before her surgery, and they had found out, and they took her back to their house back in Aberdeen. During the interrogation interviews, Zetlitz spoke of his wife's illness, and this is another one of his quotes. Word for word quote, "I was farming 2 farms, and I couldn't take care of the children. We couldn't get nobody. Pressure was applied from all sides, one way and the other, and we had a few quarrels between each other, and the children seemed to be in the road. And last night I done the deed. I killed the 3 babies and burned the house." End of quote. I don't think there's a lot of mistranslation there. Zetlitz initially, like I said, claimed that he shot the children with the pistol. And then he broke up the pistol and threw it along the way as he was running to the train. Well, in order for that to be true, those pistol pieces are still going to be out there. So the search was on. Let's go find the murder weapon. And they knew exactly where he had gone, his exact trail to the train. So it wasn't like they had to search hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. He also claimed that he bought the pistol in a store in Pocatello, but this was like the closest major city that would have guns for sale. The problem was he couldn't identify the store where he supposedly bought this pistol, and Pocatello's not that big. Over time, that gun story just started to unravel. There were no gun pieces. There was no gun purchased. I mean, all these things can be verified. In the meantime, Zetlitz's wife, Tilly, was still so sick. The funerals for the kids that was postponed until she could recover. The killings happened on a Sunday, and by Tuesday evening, Tilly went to the jail cell to see her husband. Can you even imagine what that would have been like? She never commented publicly after she visited her husband, but it was reported that she visited him 3 times that week. And every single time when she left, the reporters said she looked unwell. I'm sure that's an understatement. I'm sure she kept trying to get answers. Can you even imagine? As Mr. Zetlitz awaited district court arraignment in that really small jail in American Falls, he wasn't very far from the mortuary. The whole town is so small, and the jail and the mortuary were right by each other. Can you imagine? He's in jail right here, and his tiny little children's charred remains are in the mortuary right here. And what did he do? He was playing cards with the jailers. Apparently, the first night after he was arrested, he didn't feel up to eating dinner. Well, he missed 1 meal. Then his appetite seemed to come back. There were no signs of remorse. As time went on, the gun was never discovered. The police pressed Mr. Zetlitz and even suggested that they would drive him to Pocatello. Come on, you don't know what store it is? Hop in the car. Just show us. You got to be able to show us which store it is. Couldn't do that because there is no store, there is no gun. Eventually, he finally confessed, okay, there's no gun. Here's where it's just crazy, awful. As if shooting the kids wouldn't have been bad enough, to find out what he actually did is reminiscent of Tylee Ryan and what Chad Daybell and allegedly Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow did to her, because what he did was he used an axe. An axe head was recovered from the fire laying near the children. The autopsy report shows that the children died from being hacked. Initially, the news reports say that the children were shot because that's what they thought. That was the confession, they believed it. And the autopsy report took a while to come in. But literally the shock for that poor mother to find out that it was worse than she ever could have imagined. This is also similar to, remember the case with Josh and Susan Powell? Susan Powell went missing, and then Josh was accused of killing his wife, but they never found the body, and there were so many things, but eventually he hacked his own children to death, set the house on fire, but he stuck around and burned with them. It's just beyond awful. I think it's interesting that these two criminals are a century apart, and yet they use the same playbook. I did a video about criminal playbooks. If you want to see it, you can click on. I do think it's interesting. They seem to be using the same technique, same plan, same sociopathic personalities, I guess. So after the confession, all the evidence, everything pointed to Mr. Zetlitz. I mean, this has got to be a slam dunk case, right? Well, not so fast. I mean, even with a signed confession, his confession changed over time. Really, it just kind of changed depending on what evidence they had. But even though his lies changed, the fact that he killed his children remained. I find this next part just the most tragic part of the whole thing. As time went by, the reasons he gave for the killing, he didn't even try to say, no, it was in the heat of passion. He had a lovely dinner with his friend, tucked his kids to bed. They were all asleep. And then he carried out his horrible, evil plan. Eventually, he pled to second-degree murder. His sentence was very much reduced from first-degree murder. And I don't know. I wonder if today, in today's society, if that would have happened, because there would have been such an outrage. Like, everyone would have to answer for, why did you change it to second degree when there's, I don't know. Hopefully that wouldn't have happened today, but nonetheless, it happened. Second-degree murder. I want to read an article that was written back in the day once he pled second-degree murder, and I think it really tells a lot. They talked a little bit different than we do now, but it still is very relevant. So I'm going to read it word for word, how it was written. And it's called Sparing a Fiend. So just for those that don't know, because we don't really say fiend very much, but a fiend, the definition, is a wicked or cruel person, a fiend thirsty for blood and revenge, an unhumanly wicked or cruel person. So here it is, quoting. Possibly so that the country might be spared expense of a trial, and that's the only thing that anybody could even figure out, why they would switch to second-degree murder. Okay, I'm throwing myself in there. Back to the quote. Adolf Zetlitz was permitted to come into court in Idaho and plead guilty to second-degree murder. He was thereupon given an undetermined sentence of 25 years to life, which means that he will probably be paroled in about a dozen years. Okay, here's me on the side note again. 12 years for murdering 3 children? Oh, you haven't even begun to hear the last of this. Okay, continuing on with my quote. They were about to electrocute a woman in Illinois who, in a jealous rage, fired a couple of shots into her husband and killed him. When the governor saved her by committing the sentence to more than 100 years so that she can't be released until she has served better than 50 years. Compare her crime with that committed to the man in Idaho. His wife was in the hospital, and as he told the story, he couldn't take care of the children and operate the ranch too. The children, ranging in ages from 2 to 5, seemed to be in the road, he said. So this human fiend shot all 3 of his children and set fire to the house. Bodies were burned almost beyond recognition. The bullet holes were found. Actually, as we know, it was hacked up bodies were found. And then back to my quote. And for this triple crime, Zetlitz may serve 12 years and then will be free. He has been spared by representatives of the law who would seem to have thought more of costs than they did justice. Okay, that was a report in the paper on February 26, 1937, regarding Adolf Zetlitz Jr. Okay, here comes the most horrific part, I feel like, from this whole thing. In 1936, the year that the murders occurred, Mr. Zetlitz was 38 years old. By the time Zetlitz was 43 years old, he was living in Oregon. Okay, so if the murder happened when he was 38, let's say he got tried by the time he was 39. By the time he's 43, so 4 years later, he's living in Oregon and getting remarried to Laura Elizabeth Manuel. Together, they had an egg farm in Oregon. He lived until 1975, when he died at the age of 76. So, murdered 3 of your kids, spent 4 years in jail, live until you're 76. Died of natural causes. I wonder if his second wife knew of his past. We can never know. The craziest part of this entire event is that it all happened in Idaho, where I was born and raised. My grandfather was only 3 years younger than Adolf Zetlitz, and he lived in American Falls. I wonder what he thought of all of this at the time. He was an intellectual. Wish I would have had these conversations with him before he died. It appeared Adolf was a card-playing fella, and so was my grandfather. I have to wonder, did they play cards together in the local underground casino? All I can say is this is a tragedy from the beginning to the end. I personally lived in Idaho until I was 18 years old, and I never heard of this story in all those years. I mean, I would hear little ghost stories here and there, but I never heard about this particular one. All I can say is justice in this case did not prevail, in my opinion. I hope that never happens again. Wish I could say that his ending was a life without parole, but it was not. But there's more stories where that comes from, so go ahead and subscribe, because I've got plenty more where this came from, and I'll see you again soon. See ya.